And so when you think about staging colorism, in mainstream media, in media depictions, it makes you question, what do you want to see, right? What do you want to see? Because, I'm a mother. We're watching shows. I know Miss Rachel is very popular right now, but there's another girl. She's a black girl. She's similar to Miss Rachel. I think her name is Zoe or something of that nature. I don't know. Victoria, maybe. And obviously, she's not doing as well on YouTube. But when I think about our very early socializations with white female teachers, right, white authoritative figures, in regards to education, there is a great sense of reverence. And I think that that's kind of where the turning point is, and that's where it starts. You know what I mean? Like, we start talking about colorism, we start talking about the low self-esteem, and you start associating things with, good and bad, blackness, whiteness, and so forth, right? And so I think that we can have a little bit more control, in regards to how we socialize young black children, by being more mindful of the media that they consume, right? So just quite naturally, if you're a teacher, I mean, you may have had a mean teacher, right? A mean teacher, someone who pinched you, because that's a real thing that has happened for some people, and maybe even worse. But there really is, and I even think about myself, just a sidebar here. I'm like, man, I don't think I was ever shy. I developed this sense of shyness and this sense of like quietness because I think I was punished, during my earlier childhood educational years. I think there was something in that. I think that shyness was more so a matter of intimidation. And I think it was a personality trait that I adopted to kind of cope with being in schools where, the teachers are white and so forth. And so I think there's really something in that, even for myself, as I'm sitting here thinking about it. But I think if we can start to be more mindful of the early childhood images that we allow to be inflicted on the minds of our children, I think that could play a huge role. Now, I'm not saying don't watch Miss Rachel. I'm not saying, because the thing about Black people is that we are actually progressive in terms of our psychology. I think that, yes, by and large, a lot of us are struggling with, psychological enslavement. But I do think that those of us who are progressive, I would actually argue, are persons who can clearly say, from a neutral perspective that, hey, there are good and bad people, right? I think there's a level of like spiritual heightenedness, you can say, or perhaps a new level on Maslow's hierarchy of needs that allows many of us to kind of enter into this space where we can kind of exist within American society, and we can be aware of race and we can be aware of racism, but it doesn't paint our world, right? We're able to kind of see a world beyond our race and racism. And I think that, for those of us, we could easily argue that, hey, this is a television show. This is, it's not fair to say, don't watch white, television shows for your children. But I think what I'm saying is that, it's this right here that will have a baby, out in public, and the baby will smile at the white woman, and the baby will frown at the Black woman, or the baby will be indifferent, or the baby will be like, how do I interact with this person, right? So it's these very subtle social cues that are inflicted in the minds of our children, inflicted in our psychology very early on, right? You have to understand you're seeing this very happy person, right? Whether it's your teacher, whatever the case may be, right? Because we know that there's a lack of representation. I don't think I've ever had a Black teacher until I was in the 7th grade. She was very mean. She was very stern. And I'm not even sure if she was mean. I think, quite naturally, the time in which she grew up, I mean, who knows what she endured behind in her private life and behind the lens of her students, right? We're working within public education. Like, there's no telling, she was not one of many, as a Black woman. And so I'm sure in order for her to go about acquiring her sense of respect from students, from staff and faculty, she kind of had to adopt this kind of like no BS persona. And you'll see that amongst a lot of Black women because, we're taught that we can disrespect Black women. We're taught that, all these really negative things about Black women. But when it comes to white women, we see this friendly, quote unquote, idealized feminine woman that is nice. You know what I mean? That is kind. That is all these different things. I mean, think of the movie Matilda, right? And as I've gotten older, it makes a lot of sense why I didn't like watching a lot of TV, right? And why I don't watch a lot of TV. And I think that this happened once I began to renew my mind. And I think it kind of happened on a more subconscious level. I don't even think it was anything I was conscious of. But I started to notice how I didn't really like watching TV. And I still don't really watch TV to this day. I'm a little bit older now, so I will watch the local news. But if I do find myself watching a movie, it is preferably a Black movie. And I didn't know that this was something that I was doing intentionally, right? Like I'm saying, this is something that I kind of started noticing within myself as I began to read and delve into African American history and sort of like renew my mind on a subconscious level. I think what really was a bit of I don't want to say a turnoff, but for lack of better words in this moment, a turnoff for me with, watching TV and movies and things like that was that the storyline was always featuring, white man, white woman, this very beautiful, wholesome family, right? A beautiful, wholesome love story, and it always felt unattainable. It always felt like something aspirational. And I think for myself, as a young girl, as someone who was growing up reading about African American history, that got tiresome. It grew tiresome aspiring to the lives of white Americans, and I don't think that necessarily when it comes to Black films, like, from filmmakers like Tyler Perry, that the films brought a sense of grievance to me, because I do think that oftentimes the films do reflect our reality. And I think despite the critics in regards to Tyler Perry's work, right, I would argue that he typically ends things with a positive spin, right? Sometimes it is that matriarch. Obviously most of his films are about Medea, the matriarch. But I was listening to Tina Knowles, and she, labeled her book Matriarch, and just kind of how recently I think there's been a reclamation of the word matriarch and what it means to be the head of the family for so many Black women, not, just because we're domineering and, we want to emasculate our Black men, but because of who we are and our presence and what that femininity looks like for us, right? I think femininity as characterized by white women is this very docile, passive, kind of like into self love, type of thing. But I think when you talk about matriarch, I think you're talking about, I don't want to say headmaster, because I know that would be, perhaps an inappropriate use of the word, but I'm saying like boss, you know what I mean? Like boss of the family. And I think that is our femininity. You know what I mean? It's powerful, right? It's ancestral, it's powerful, it's spiritual, it's all those different things. And so I just think that, and so I say all that to say, I just wanted to get on here and say, I think that you can kind of start by developing the self-esteem within your children by being mindful of what you allow them to watch, right? If they're growing up in public schools and they're being bullied by the Black kids, you got to be mindful of that. If they're being bullied by family members, you take them around certain family members and it's dysfunctional and they're talking about the color of their skin or their hair being nappy or whatever the case may be, you got to check that. You got to kind of distance yourself from that, because what happens is young Black children grow up with such traumatic experiences from their peers, right? And so when they see white women and white people and on TV and they got the big happy family, it changes things. Now, I don't know if I'll have time here, but I want to kind of touch on colorism in terms of media and how our internalized self-hatred actually creates a bit of a reverse effect in colorism, right? And so what I'm trying to say is that, we're so focused on how the Black the Black woman who is richer of complexion is treated, that we don't take notice to our stereotypes and our colorism towards fairer skinned or, brighter skin or whatever you want to call it. I don't want to go too far. I'll say a lighter hue of melanin, right? Because I want to be mindful of how I'm describing these things. We don't really take into consideration the stereotypes we have towards others who are a little bit, on the spectrum going the other way, And so what happens is, we'll see things like, for example, a show that I actually found myself really enjoying was Blackish, right? I found that the writers really managed to touch on so many political and just, so many issues within our community, so many things that really deserve, recognition and things that we should talk about. And, they did it in a way that was educational and they did it in a way that was fun and lighthearted. And I think to integrate things like racism and so forth into a television series, right, and do it with the Black family and do it with so much grace, elegance, and creativity, that is brilliance in the making, right? That's what I always say is my reformed version of advocacy, right? It's like being the writer in the room to create the stories, being the doctor in the room to write the scripts and to see the patients in the urban community. It's being the teacher to teach the kids to read. You know what I mean? That's my version of advocacy. But I know that for so many people, they would see that and they would attack Tracy Ellis, and they would say, well, she's a lighter skinned woman, and it's this and it's that and it's this, and it's like, it's this right here. This is colorism, y'all. You know what I mean? I know we're so quick to, we want to stick up for our sisters who are richer in complexion, because we have to acknowledge that undoubtedly they have a different experience in American society, right? Like, their realities are oftentimes, unfortunately, a lot more harsh, and we do need to stand up and we need to acknowledge that. But we also got to acknowledge the fact that, hey, listen, we can be very dismissive, and we can be very we could just be very dismissive and discarding of others who are on the spectrum, whatever, it's like a stereotype, but it's going the other way. And I think that can be very harmful as well. And oftentimes it takes away from our humanity, right? As a brown skinned woman who's kind of sitting in the middle there, it takes away from our humanity. It takes away from what's real for us as well, because here's the truth, right? We know at the end of the day, as a collective, we're all treated as Black people. Okay. We know what I mean? Like, we know at the end of the day, regardless if a person is given access to a room, which is real, you know what I mean? I can even see it in my own life, and that ease is real. And I don't think we can have these conversations simultaneously. I don't think I can sit here and say, well, such and such has an easy life, but at the same time, we're stereotyping such and such. No, that's a conversation for another day. You know what I mean? Because we can't talk about privilege and how we stereotype one another in the same conversation in regards to lighter skinned Black people. We cannot do that. Okay. So that's a conversation for another day. What I'm touching on right now is just to say that, sometimes we look at people who have lighter skin, whether brown skin, whatever, and we esteem a lot of negative stereotypes towards them. We assume that they have an easy life. We assume that they nasty. We assume that they jealous. We assume that they think they better than us. And it's crazy. We assume that they're not Black. We essentially erase their Blackness because we're not privy, rather, right? We're not privy to their experiences. And I think that is something that is incredibly, destabilizing in terms of our unity, and even in sisterhood and even in our communities in general. I'll typically find that, Black women of a richer complexion typically rock together, and they don't want to rock with you. They don't want to sit with you. They don't want you coming over, being a part of their friend group. You know what I mean? Like, a lot of times these sisters are kind of like rolling together, and, that's real, that's real. And I just think we discredit one another, and we feel like, oh, you're not hard enough, and it's sad. And I think this is why it's important, we have the movies and we're talking about Black women in luxury and ease, because it's important for, all Black women to know that at the end of the day, we're women. So when you see a woman of a lighter skin complexion and perhaps she is living a life of ease, I do think that that's a conversation, like I said, for another day. But I think at the same time, you can recognize that, you're worthy of that ease as well. That ideal of ease and womanhood, or whatever the case may be, is not something that you're excluded from. You have to take back your own power, within your mind and within your life, whether that's changing your circumstances or doing the little that you can do with what you got. A lot of times that looks like renewing your mind, So I think it's important for us to recognize that. And instead of seeing it as a thing to be jealous of, like I said, it's a conversation for another day. Absolutely, you can be jealous of a person who is just outright living a different life and had different hands dealt, and you see different privileges play out for them. Absolutely, that's a conversation for another day. But what I'm saying is that, instead of looking at it like, oh, I'm just outside this box because of whatever, it's like, no, you are right inside that box, not because of the color of your skin, but because you're a woman. You know what I mean? You're a Black woman at that. So, colorism plays a huge role. And, Hooks was just talking about, Black men and hypersexuality, right? I started thinking about the podcast I've been making. Y'all know I've been a little on one. But I started thinking about the podcast I was making, and I was talking about Black men, and then the how they use us and dog us and all these different things. And so much of this is just, it's nothing more than societal conditioning, and all the ways in which showing your wild oats, creating broken homes, going through, all this craziness, right? Like, all the repercussions, all the consequences that just come from living that life. The truth is that that's dehumanizing for a lot of Black men. It's incredibly dehumanizing. It's not empowering. but they're just told that's what you have to do. And many times Black men are esteemed in that. The Black male's body is heavily admired. At one point it was considered beastie. So a lot of conversations here. This was just a quick little snippet, I guess you could say. This was a clip of the pod. Let's see how many minutes we got on here. 14 minutes. This was definitely a podcast. I hope you guys have a great day. And, I'm going to leave you with my thoughts. And I just hope that you'll take the time to hear me out and think about how you look at, women of all colors. You see what I'm saying? Black women of every color, and do you make the sisters who are a little bit lighter, do you make them prove their Blackness? Do you automatically put them in the box of something to be hostile towards, because you're negating their experiences and what they've gone through? We may have different preferences, by American society, right? We may have different preferences in terms of who's desirable and who isn't, but behind closed doors within our Black community, we're all going through the same things. You know what I mean? We've all experienced some crazy stuff. You see what I'm saying? So I just think that that's the part where we got to start connecting with humanity and kind of get beyond color. Love ya. Peace.